Hello and welcome to today's Encore Connect and Explore webinar. We're so glad that you are here today, and we have a fantastic program for you. Today, our spotlight is going to showcase highlights from some of Encore's projects this past year. We are going to hear about advancing measurement for childhood obesity research, about a toolkit for evaluating healthy weight programs. We will also hear about the economic impact of built environment improvement for physical activity. And finally, we will hear about youth active travel to school surveillance initiative. So a lot of good stuff on tap today. I'd like to introduce you to those of us who are on the webinar. I'm your moderator, Karen Hilliard from the Encore Coordinating Center. And let me introduce you to today's panelists. We have with us today Dr. David Berrigan, who's the program director at the National Institutes of Health. And we also have Dr. Brooke Balai, a medical officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC. We have Hatija Zaganor, a behavioral scientist, also from CDC, and Dr. Stephanie George, an epidemiologist and program director at CDC. So welcome to all of them. If you have a question for our speakers during the webinar today, I want to ask that you please write it using the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. You will see when you look at the bottom of your screen that there's both Q&A and chat. Please be sure your questions go into the Q&A. That's where we will take questions from later in the program. If you need any technical assistance, however, you can let us know using the chat box. If you're having any trouble logging into the webinar or any technical issues at all, you can email us at encore@fhi360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem. So again, to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. We will only be sending questions to our panelists that are pasted in the Q&A box. I also want to let you know, if you normally tune in for our webinars, we're going to be doing something today a little different with the Q&A. Instead of saving all the questions for the end of all of the speakers, we're going to pause for a moment between presentations and have a chance for each speaker to take a question or two. So I invite all members of the audience to enter questions as they occur to you, and we'll take some after each speaker as well as at the end of all the presentations. All right, I want to also let you know that we will be tweeting today's webinar from the @Encore Twitter account. And if you'd like to join that conversation, you can use the hashtag #ConnectExplore. I want to give you a little history on what brings us to the presentations today. Encore launched in 2009 to accelerate progress to reduce childhood obesity in America. And Encore focuses on efforts that have the greatest potential to benefit children, teens, their families, and their communities in which they live. The mission of the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research, or NCCOR, is to accelerate progress in reducing childhood obesity for all children, with particular attention to high-risk populations and communities. NCCOR actually brings together 4 of the nation's leading research funders: the CDC, NIH, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and USDA. And we work in tandem to manage projects and to reach common goals, to coordinate funding, to make the most of available resources, and to share insights and expertise to strengthen research. Beyond the 4 funding partners, NCCOR also works with leading researchers and practitioners across the US to ensure that our efforts facilitate ongoing research, inform future research, and meet the needs of diverse stakeholders implementing obesity prevention and control efforts on the ground. NCCOR was built on the first 4 goal areas seen here. And I'll let you read the slide for yourself. Later, in addition to those first 4 goals, we added a fifth goal: working with non-traditional health partners to expand the work of the collaborative. Today, we're going to be hearing about some of the accomplishments of 2021 projects for Encore. And so I'm very pleased to introduce in just a moment our panelists. Before we get started, though, I want to put up a quick poll question and just get a sense of who is on the call and what your opinions might be. So prior to today, I'll wait for that poll question to come up. Okay. Prior to today, were you aware of NCCOR, of the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research? Yes or no? So please go ahead and vote on screen, and then we will show the results in just a moment. We are going to ask a second question in a moment about what your role is. So we'll give just one more moment for that intro poll, and we can see the results. Okay, so fantastic. We have about 75% of the folks on the call today are familiar with NCCOR, but we have 25% of people who were not familiar with NCCOR and its work before. And that is, it's great to welcome new folks to the work that we're doing. And of course, we appreciate those of you who are already familiar with our work and tune in regularly to these webinars. Let me ask also how you categorize your role. So second question here, would you call yourself primarily a practitioner, a researcher, a student, or something else? And I know some of you may wear several hats, so please just go ahead and vote for your primary role. We'll give just a couple of moments for people to go ahead and vote. And you can do that on the screen. We'll give just one more moment and see the results here. Okay, so great. So we've got about 40% of the folks on the phone considering themselves to be researchers, about 20% practitioners, about 8% students, and then 34% of you that occupy some other role. And that is great. We welcome all of you, and we'll be talking later on about some special resources for students. And of course, you'll be hearing about resources for practitioners and researchers as well as we go through today's projects. All right, so today we are going to be spotlighting 4 projects from the past year. The first one of these is advancing measurement for childhood obesity research. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. David Berrigan.
Karen, thanks so much for getting us started. And I'm always glad to share about NCCOR, which has created a terrific set of resources for childhood obesity research, but also resources for practitioners and students, providing educational background, training, and access to a lot of products that can help you interpret extant research and guide your thinking about how to advance. Next slide. Oh, no, stay on this slide, sorry. So a key priority for NCCOR has been to promote better understanding of measurement issues and the use of high quality and most appropriate measurements. We've addressed this through a combination of 6 different kinds of activities: developing new measures, reviewing what is known and maximizing cross-sectoral collaboration, building measurement tools, guidance, and data resources, helping to develop research methods and approaches, enhancing data linkage, enhancing capacity, dissemination, and collaboration, and really trying to promote the expansion of data collection, research, and publication to inform efforts to address this really serious public health problem of childhood obesity. Next slide. In the last couple of years, prior to the pandemic, we held 3 workshops funded by our partner, the JPB Foundation. Workshop 1 concerned advancing measurement of individual behaviors related to childhood obesity. Workshop 2, advancing measurement for high-risk populations and communities related to childhood obesity. And workshop 3, advancing measurement of environmental and policy influences on childhood obesity. There's a white paper posted about the detailed results of each workshop available on the NCCOR website, and I commend those to you. And additionally, I want to highlight that workshop 2 resulted in a review paper by the Johns Hopkins Evidence-Based Practice Center and the creation of a decision tool to help determine path towards measures adaptation. So those are terrific resources that you can find on the webpage. Next slide. We've just summarized all 3 workshops in a paper from December 2021 in American Journal of Preventive Medicine. This paper has a myriad of terrific recommendations for areas that need further work and research. So I commend that to you. This is also one of the last papers led by Rachel Ballard, who recently retired. And she was one of the founders of NCCOR, a real leader in obesity research and a mentor of mine. So hats off to Rachel. I hope this was a suitable going away present. Next slide. So each of the workshops and each white paper and the summary paper summarize a wide variety of recommendations related to research needs in the individual, environmental, and under-resourced population domains. Some common top-level themes arose from in all 3 workshops and from the many conversations with leading experts that we commissioned via these workshops. Capturing policies, practices, and behaviors to improve health through new measures was a critical theme. Engaging with communities arose repeatedly, and the need for triangulation, the idea that no one measure can necessarily capture all the dimensions of salient constructs in this area arose. So I think these common themes give a broad picture of needs to advance measurement in this area. Next slide. Some of the further highlights that arose from the workshops and that especially captured my attention included individual measurement needs with a focus on children under 6 and especially 0 to 24, where there's significant measurement challenges and perhaps not as much research as in some of the other areas. A pressing need to address sleep and advancing triangulation with multiple measures, as I mentioned earlier. For the workshop on at-risk communities, a key focus was the need to make sure that measures were appropriately adapted for different populations, rather than just assuming that a measure adapted in one population could fully capture the desired constructs in other populations. And in the environment and policy arena, there was a call to develop measures and surveillance systems for underdeveloped areas, such as social supports, a more complete picture of the food environment, and aspects of housing and income as they're connected to childhood obesity. There's also a need to better synthesize and share existing data and to evaluate natural experiments with the best possible measures so as to inform policymakers. Last slide. Looking ahead, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of NCCOR's landmark tools, the Measures Registry, and the Catalog of Surveillance Systems. So we're working on a paper to summarize some of the contributions of the registry and the catalog and to look towards future directions. Sleep was emphasized in all 3 workshops, and NCCOR has a work group that's adding a sleep variable to the catalog of surveillance systems to help people identify data resources concerning sleep. And lastly, social and environmental factors continue to be a key focus of NCCOR. Work groups currently are addressing trail use in diverse populations, walkability, early childhood education in light of COVID, walk to school programs, economic aspects of the built environment, and other topics that we'll be hearing some about today. So I think this social determinants of health angle is going to emerge more and more as part of NCOR's activities. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Berrigan. And let me just remind the audience again that we are going to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions for each speaker as we go, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions for all the speakers at the end. So let me invite you to put any questions that you have into the Q&A. So I've got one question here that I'll go ahead and ask. There are so many factors that impact childhood obesity. What do you think should be the highest priorities?
Right now, I'm especially interested in a greater attention to some of the social determinants of health, and particularly to income. Substantial research in the past has suggested that income is a critical risk factor and correlate of childhood obesity. But right now, we're in the middle of a bunch of grand policy experiments involving giving families with children greater financial resources. So I would love to see ongoing and rigorous evaluation of the effects of those programs on the prevalence of childhood obesity. That's a multi-year project, and it's going to require efforts to better measure the economic context and the outcomes of those childhood benefits. But I think that's an area where we can inform policy and help inform efforts to, strengthen the way in which we address children's health and healthy development via these sorts of programs.
Excellent, thank you. And I know that a number of white papers and publications are emerging about some of the efforts that you just talked about, and I want to encourage people to check out the NCOR webpage for new products related to that. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and we'll come back to any questions for individual speakers that we haven't gotten to now. We'll go ahead and circle back to those at the end. So let me go ahead and introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Brooke Balai, and he will share information about the toolkit for evaluating healthy weight programs.
Thank you very much for having me today. Today we're going to discuss as Karen mentioned, the toolkit for evaluating healthy weight programs. Next slide, please. So very early on, NCOR, as we've heard today, sought to gather findings from child obesity prevention research that could be readily translated into everyday practice for public health practitioners, but also for clinicians as well. To this end, the Engaging Healthcare Providers and Systems Project was initiated in about 2015, so a few years after NCOR actually started. This work group conducted a series of workshops and focus groups to better understand what might be of most value to child obesity prevention in the clinical setting. And that's what led to the development of this toolkit for the evaluation of childhood weight management programs. Next slide, please. This toolkit was released in September of 2021. And as you can see there, at the time of this slide's making, there were over 208,000 page views for that toolkit, which makes it rather unique and successful as well. Of course, briefly put, the toolkit provides evaluation support for these weight management programs, all the way from how do you think about your organizational capacity, identifying what process measures you will pursue and evaluate, and all the way, of course, to outcome measures, including weight-related measures, cost-related measures, and so forth. The toolkit does this in a unique way, realizing that every program might be in different stages of development and expertise. It provides, if you will, a menu of potential metrics and strategies to evaluate depending on where that program is. So for example, very early on, a program might only be able to track weight-related outcomes in terms of those outcome measures, but as they progress in ability and evaluation expertise, they might be able to take on other metrics as well. And so it provides a tiered list, if you will, of choices that programs can undertake. And of course, these have implications, right? So they can help you, if you at the program level, deciding how you can communicate your results with stakeholders. And this has long-term implications for sustainability and continued funding. The toolkit also provides a resource library with guides to, with links to other guides and databases and research articles that programs can look at and get more information about. And there's also a section in that toolkit on remote evaluation, not remote administration of a weight management program, but rather how can you evaluate a program remotely. And of course, nowadays we think about these issues more and more frequently. We do believe that this is a living document, a living toolkit, if you will. And so we anticipate updating both the resource list and the information on some of these strategies, such as remote evaluation, as time goes on. And that URL that you see at the bottom is directly to the toolkit. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we'll continue to monitor the use of this toolkit and update the resource library and much of the content as well. Have you used the toolkit? If so, or if you have suggestions on how we might improve it, please send us a message at the email identified here. And I think that's it for me.
All right, thank you so much. And again, let me give folks in the audience an opportunity. If you have any questions directly for Dr. Balai, he can answer those now, or we can take questions for him at the end as well. And here's one question for you. BMI is often used as an evaluation metric. However, it can be misleading. Is that taken into consideration in the toolkit?
Yes. So, you know, as we mentioned previously, it's included in the toolkit as an evaluation metric, but oftentimes it's also an outcome measurement in many trials and studies, of course. It can be difficult to interpret sometimes, but I think the key point is to realize that you know, if in children, of course, using it appropriately and percentiles and so forth, using the right procedures and standards can really ensure that it's used appropriately both as an outcome measure of your program and at the individual level as well, but also as an evaluation measure for your program as a whole when it comes to you know, thinking about how effective your program is and communicating that with stakeholders.
Okay, excellent. And again, if you have further questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We'll be taking questions for all of the panelists at the end, and be sure to type it in the Q&A and not into the chat. We'll look for it there. All right, we're going to move to our next speaker now. Thank you so much. And I'd like to introduce to you all now Hatija Zaganor, who is going to talk with us about the economic impact of the built environment improvement for physical activity.
Thanks so much, Karen, and hello, everyone. So I'm talking today a little bit about the economic impact of built environment improvement for physical activity work group. That is really a mouthful, so we like to call ourselves the Econ work group, which you may hear me refer to that throughout this presentation. So next slide, please. So Encore sought to determine indicators that can be used to justify investments in built environment improvements. So the focus for the Econ work group is really to think about economic indicators, and simply put, it's because these the health impact of these built environment improvements or activity-friendly places really doesn't sell, especially among those decision makers that can actually have the capacity to make these types of changes. in their communities. So it's really important for us to determine what are some of the most influential, some of the most feasible types of indicators that can be used to measure the benefits of built environment improvements that can be shared with decision makers and create the types of changes that we'd like to see across communities. Next slide, please. So just to provide some background for folks that may be unfamiliar with this work group or who are new to NCCOR, we started this project about 2 years ago or so, and it kicked off with an expert panel where we were able to identify somewhere around 70 plus in economic indicators. Following that expert panel, we actually worked with the experts to have them rank these indicators on properties of influence, quality, and feasibility. And as a result of that, we were actually able to identify a list of what we consider our top 10 highly rated indicators that kind of were rated highly across those 3 properties. So for folks that were really interested in our process and how we identify these indicators, please go ahead and take a look at the manuscript where we published about this process and how we narrowed down things. I believe that will be posted in the chat. So once we had our list of these top 10 indicators, we really wanted to get this out into the world and really be able to share it with the public health community. And so what we have done is organized a set of listening sessions with some additional experts to find out just how we could do this, understand really what is needed, and also created sort of this translation document for those experts to react to during that time. When we have those listening sessions, we had sort of a mixed response from the experts on that translation document that we had originally shared. And I think the idea is we were originally trying to do too much what we were trying to accomplish in that translation document, and those experts really helped us scale it back. Because really our goal was to create something that resonates with decision makers, but also could be something that public health community could use, to either help decision makers understand how to make that business case and help them understand how particular indicators actually relate to the priorities that a decision maker might care about, and to also help create sort of an opportunity for public health researchers to look at particular indicators that might help spur more evidence across them. So after all that, we kind of, we went back, we realized we needed to do some work to really get our translation document right, and what else we were trying to do with this work. And I'm happy to say that we're really close on developing a 2-page translation document. And hopefully that will be out soon. So next slide, please. So yes, as I mentioned, our 2-pager is getting really close. It'll hopefully be out and shared accordingly. Hopefully folks are on the NCCOR listserv and will know just when that's ready and available for the public. But before we do that, we also want to create a page of web materials that can be used to educate decision makers and practitioners on how to exactly use these economic indicators in a way that's equitable to promote these built environment improvements, because something that we definitely hear a lot about is oftentimes when these sorts of economic investments are made or these built environment improvements are made, there tend to be winners and losers. And our whole goal is to really help understand how this can be done in sort of a way where there are, winners across the board. So I think that's about it. I'm going to go ahead and stop there and see if there's any questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so we have, so I'm looking to see if we have a question in the Q&A. And one question for you is, how do you recommend presenting this to city or county government officials to invest in the built environment when the government leaders may have other economic priorities?
It's a great question, and definitely something that we were really thinking about as we were recreating our translation document. So our hope is really that these tools can show decision makers how some of the most common economic priorities that they care about, such as housing or economic development, are actually related to the built environment and can actually support these activity-friendly built environment investments that we're talking about. So if a public health practitioner is trying to make a case to decision makers, oftentimes that public health practitioner, is from that community or is familiar with some of those economic priorities that decision maker might be interested in. So the idea is for them to tailor and share those economic indicators that would be of most interested to that decision maker so that they can get on board. Really just meeting the decision makers where they're at and showing them how these particular indicators can help them accomplish the economic priorities that they care about while still being good for business, which we think many decision makers care about, but also being good for people as well as health and the environment. So really it's like sharing a menu of options and giving users that flexibility to share which indicators might be most relevant and most appropriate given the needs of a particular community and the priorities of a given decision. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. And let me say to those of you who are putting questions in the Q&A, if we haven't gotten to your question yet, we are going to circle back to these as we get to all of to questions for all of the panelists at the end. So keep putting those questions in the Q&A box and we'll get them one way or the other. All right, I want to go ahead and introduce our final presenter for today, Dr. Stephanie George, and she is going to be talking about the Youth Active Travel to School Surveillance Initiative.
Hi, good afternoon. Again, as the other speakers have indicated, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about this project that we have completed in 2021. So this is our Youth Active Travel to School Surveillance Initiative. When we led off the beginning of this webinar, you heard about some of NCOR's major priorities. And while this does map with lots of them, given the breadth of this topic, it's most closely mapped to that second priority about increasing and improving surveillance. So we'll have some links in the chat here, but these are two of the products that have come out of this group that I'll walk you through today. The one on the left is actually our literature review that we completed to understand what is being measured, what is the surveillance that exists. And on the right, you'll see actually a copy of our publicly available white paper, which again, I'll walk you through some highlights of, but summarizes really all that's been put into this really cross thought about how we could improve youth active travel to school and its surveillance. Next slide, please. So Encore in 2017 formed a physical activity work group to foster this planning and engagement across many, many partners related to physical activity. The Active Travel to School Surveillance Initiative built upon the Surgeon General's 2015 Step It Up call to action to promote walking in walkable communities. In this report, it named active travel to school programs as one way that youth can improve their physical activity. So our work group got thinking about this understudied and possibly really great idea for how we might improve physical activity in the United States for kids. The current physical activity guidelines for children recommend 60 minutes a day of physical activity for our youth, but only 1/4 of youth meet those guidelines. So could this be the untapped potential for how we might improve childhood obesity prevention? Well, if we don't have measurements for what this is and how youth are being active traveling to school, then it would be very difficult to see its contribution, not only to child health and obesity prevention, but also in the context of other physical activity they may be doing. So next slide, please. Our work group took some action, and the first piece here is that we commissioned a systematic literature review to understand what are the surveillance systems that are available that are measuring youth active travel to school. And in fact, this was published this year in the Journal of Healthy Eating and Active Living. It's also available on the Encore website. And we found that there's very few. There's a dearth of systems that are looking at physical activity traveling to school and from school. And because of that, we engaged in a virtual workshop. We engaged various experts in active travel to school. And we talked about this. On the right-hand side is a little highlight from our key summary points from our workshop. Building on this literature review showing that there are really few surveillance systems that are tracking this. We do have some really wonderful local evaluation that's taking place, but we need a more comprehensive view to be able to understand what's going on with this behavior. So we talked in this workshop about incorporating questions about active travel to school behaviors, the environmental supports, and program and policy supports, and that all of these were important. And that actually, because this kind of physical activity contributes to these patterns nationwide, because it occurs in local contexts and is influenced by state laws, but it occurs in communities, that measurement, not only at the national, but the state and local level, all of these are important with respect to all of these kinds of measures. And our participants worked in the workshop as well as a prioritization activity afterwards to think about the following few things. We wanted to couple what indicators would be really important for surveillance, as well as a pragmatic consideration of those data collection opportunities. So I encourage you to take a look at this very comprehensive white paper. It's very easily understandable. There's really also a really wonderful appendix as well with some of the additional pieces. And so check this out. Our hope is, next slide. Our hope is that we want to not just have the book stop here with this wonderful white paper. We've really in this workshop, as well as our after workshop conversations, developed an idea of where those key recommendations and opportunities are for the field, not just for research, for practice as well. And we need all of our partners involved in this to make this happen. And we are currently, it's under review at a journal. We've our federal team, as well as our amazing support, Vondo from Encore, have put together a commentary summarizing these research gaps and opportunities, hoping that we can reach an even broader audience to draw attention to this important need in youth physical activity surveillance. And before I close here, I just want to acknowledge, as David mentioned earlier, just the true collaborative nature of this Encore project. I'm the one who's lucky enough to be here speaking to you today for 5 minutes on this topic, but this would not be possible without our incredible team at CDC, Emily Ussery, Kathy Watson, Jeff Whitfield, Sarah Sliwa, and Kelly Cornett. At NIH, we've had the pleasure of working with David Berrigan, Drew Bremer, and of course, the lovely Vondo, who has supported this work group for many years to get to this stage of these products. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. And let me invite you, if anyone has a question specifically for Stephanie, please type it in, and we're going to be circling back to questions for all of our panelists in just a moment here. So I'll give you an opportunity to type in anything that you have for Stephanie. And in the meantime, I'm going to pop back up to a question that came in for David Berrigan, and that was whether he could give an example of some of the equity issues in using economic indicators. So David.
Sure, I don't want to take away from Hatice and her deep familiarity with the economic analysis paper, but I thought that was a really good question from Chris Logan. And an area where I see that as an issue, if I understand the question correctly, might involve housing. So there's been a lot of concern about gentrification and its potential equity impact. And so if you use as an economic indicator home value, you might conclude that gentrification was a universal good. But of course, if you only use the value of homes in some neighborhood, you would be neglecting the adverse impacts of displacement. And so I think that's an example of of a challenge in selecting economic indicators is this need to make sure you think about diverse consequences of some policy or program, some of which are captured by purely financial measures and others by different other kinds of measures related to well-being.
Okay, excellent. Go ahead, Hatija.
Yes, that's a great example, David, and I hope that kind of answers the question. And really what we are trying to do is, what we've heard a lot is oftentimes economic indicators, do lead to displacement. And we really are trying to avoid that. And when we position and, create our website, we really want to give decision makers the tools to understand how they can use these indicators to not, lead to displacement and other inequitable issues that may arise as a result. So really thinking about how do they measure these benefits in a way that others can, everyone across the board can benefit, not necessarily just a few folks. And, if members are getting displaced from their community, then they're not reaping those economic benefits once, a built environment improvement is made or a community is made to be more activity friendly. So really that's our goal, is really position decision makers to have the tools to be able to make these decisions and use these indicators in a way that can promote more equitable investment.
And Hatija, while you are still speaking, if you could also answer a question that came in, just to remind people of what the 10 economic indicators are that you identified.
Sure. So our highly rated indicators were walkability, vacancy rate, housing affordability, property tax revenue, retail sales per square foot, small businesses, employment rate, vehicle miles traveled, air and water quality, and life expectancy. And again, these are just sort of the top 10 indicators that we want to promote to kind of create some cohesion on things to look at across the public health community. But there are additional indicators that were identified, and you can refer back to the paper if maybe you are interested in promoting some of these benefits in your community, and find ones that might be more relevant to your particular community.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And we had a couple of questions related to BMI as a measure, and whether or not there have been studies exploring the use of waist circumference as an indicator of health risk in children, or studies that would help to establish guidelines for using waist circumference as an indicator. So I think that must be a question for Dr. Balai, but anybody is welcome to jump in.
Sure. So regarding that, I guess the second question regarding the use of waist circumference, there have been studies that looked at norms for waist circumference, and sort of the discriminative ability of waist circumference perhaps over BMI. The issue has been, those are difficult to implement. There's a lot of training that goes into using waist circumference. And so it's difficult to kind of replicate on sort of an easy kind of clinical workflow for most practices. And particularly for children who might be younger, perhaps might squirm around a little bit more, it's certainly a little more difficult. But the norms are there. And once again, particularly for those older children and adolescents, the question is kind of implementation and ease of interpretation. Regarding the use of BMI as a monitoring tool, it is a good monitoring tool, but it depends on how you're using it. So once again, in kids, we use that percentile based approach for age and gender. The difficulty comes with the extremes of BMI. So in severe obesity, once you start reaching those levels, you are probably trying best to use a measure of BMI that better tracks over time, but also tracks with risk factors. So if you really want to evaluate the kind of individual level impact and how well an intervention might be helping your children or adolescents. Be on the lookout for a soon to be released metric for severe obesity that will be released by CDC and NCHS hopefully sometime soon. But the short answer is yes, it just depends how you use it and for which group of children and or adolescents.
Okay, excellent. And I want to encourage anyone to continue typing in questions that you may have. And so a very quick question I have for is for Stephanie. And that is, one barrier that is often found in community research as to why children don't engage in physical activity outdoors is due to fear of crime in the neighborhood. And were your findings consistent with that, and what considerations were taken to address it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's something that came up quite often during the workshop. We anticipated it going in based on our read of the literature and our read of having worked in communities on this issue. But we talked about, if you can recall the slide talking about the different levels of the metrics that we talked about for behaviors and environment and program and policy supports, that piece about the context came into play for all of those, and how that context is very important, not just for individual behavior, but for thinking about the programs and policies that may or may not be at play. Let's say a community has a program or a school has a program, but the utilization of that program and the evaluation needs to take into account the fact that there may be a dangerous intersection, there may be a school start time that is completely incompatible for parents to be able to participate. And also, I'll hit it here also with the equity piece, because that came into play completely. That context matters. And I want to read something really specifically because I think it's a powerful statement. Structural racism has created this disparate physical and social landscape for active travel to school. So it's great to stand here and say that this is an amazing, untapped opportunity for kids to become active, and we should all go out and, encourage this. But an attention to context and improving that aspect is very important. And without careful attention to not only the history, but also the current environments that have kind of created these possible environments, maybe of fear or an unsafe structure to be able to walk by. Maybe it's sidewalk quality, maybe it's, lack of available crossing guards or adult presence. We can't adequately address the opportunities for and benefits of ATS, not just like the actual behavior, but even the measuring of it. And so our measurements across these contexts really need to take equity and the contextual factors at play. And that highlights also the importance of not just those objective measures, but we heard often throughout the workshop in our recommendations, which you can read in the report, how important that combination of self-report, those perceived measures, as well as those objective measures for many of these are very important to get that full read and really be able to move those levers.
Okay. And a follow-up question for you as well. Have the impacts of policing practices on youth active travel been addressed?
So that was discussed in the workshop. It's not a major recommendation or action point here, but that's something that, in those perceived measures, right, of those environmental supports, or if it's a practice and it's a policy in the community, that's evaluated and acknowledged that could potentially be a true barrier to active travel to school behavior. And the importance of acknowledging that and paying a careful attention to it was addressed.
Okay.
I could also chime in there if you don't mind and commend I think Chris Logan might have entered that question, commend him some of the work of Jennifer D. Roberts at the University of Maryland, who's done some nice work about the impact of light rail and parks and other affordances to active travel behavior, but their differential effects on different communities and on youth as well. So I think her work is of great interest in this area.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 2 minutes remaining for Q&A, and so I want to be sure that we get to any questions that we can. I've got a couple of questions here about walkability and about equity. This one is for Stephanie. Did you also consider equity in walkability between urban, suburban, and rural environments?
Yeah, definitely. So the term was used in our major findings, macro environment supports, and that includes things like land use mix and ideas like that. Definitely, I think that's a huge aspect of active travel to school and why it works or why it doesn't, and what's needed. Again, like having attention to measuring these things across levels where you want to make changes is important, because if we don't have those measurements like that, we don't have anything to help our decision makers move that along. So definitely.
Okay, great. One last very quick question that I think David may be able to answer is related to the timeframe for economic impact of BEI or built environment intervention strategies. And somebody is asking what is an ideal timeframe? Many studies and interventions are short term, i.e. 1 school year.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I just wanted to address it, although I know Hatija has some thoughts on it as well. But I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that I helped a team led by Tiffany Powell-Wiley do some work on the association between neighborhood deprivation, which included some built environment measures, and obesity. And in that study, we found that you couldn't detect an effect of the environment, an association between the environment and obesity, until 10 years of exposure had occurred. So that really calls into question short-term studies of the energy balance effects of built environment characteristics. And I think that's a challenge for our funding and research practices. So great question.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for your answers to these questions and the fantastic presentations earlier. And I want to say to the audience, this is just a small snapshot of all of the many initiatives that NCCOR is involved with. And so I hope we've given you a good review of some of these that were in the spotlight today, and that you will take a look on our website for additional information about these and other things. I want to go on now and make a few announcements before we sign off today. First of all, if you are a student, please be sure to sign up for the NCCOR Student Hub newsletter. You can sign up for that at ncor.org/e-newsletter. And while you're at the NCCOR site, be sure to check out the Student Hub webpage, where we have a lot of materials and resources that are ideal for students. If you have used any of NCCOR's tools, if you're a practitioner, a researcher, a student, whatever your role, we would love to hear about what you're doing with NCCOR resources. So please do reach out to us and let us know. You can email us at ncor@fhi360.org. And if we hear from you, we might be able to feature your story in one of our upcoming webinars. I would also like to remind you today to be sure and fill out the survey that you'll receive after this webinar to let us know what you thought and give us an idea of how we can offer more resources and more presentations that will benefit you in the future. So please do look for that survey. And if you have any other questions about NCCOR, about our upcoming activities, or about NCCOR in general, please do reach out to the NCCOR Coordinating Center. And again, our email is ncor@fhi360.org. So thank you again to our audience, and thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next NCCOR Connect and Explore webinar. Thank you so much.